It's my privilege to introduce our guest today, Bob Winter. I first heard about Agile before I came to Boise State in 2007. I even attended a 2-day Wonder workshop in Agile, and they even gave me a Scrum Master certificate. Here at Boise State, I teach courses in advanced instructional design, where we focus on personas, prototyping, and usability testing. We've been considering using the work of e-learning folks who call themselves Agile for quite a while. Unfortunately, claims about Agile are not necessarily Agile. This is where Bob comes in. He does this stuff. He's written a book on it, and I've seen him speak at ISPI. I'm delighted to have him here with us today. During our hour together, he will answer these questions. What is Agile? How do you apply Agile principles to instructional design? How do you get started with Agile as a non-software team? He will also answer your questions. Bob, we're delighted to have you with us today.
Thank you. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you for having me here today. This grew out of Steve and Josh seeing my presentation at the ISPI conference last year, and we had a nice discussion afterwards. And I think one of the things that comes up a lot with Agile by way of introduction is Agile is pretty much ubiquitous in the world of software development now. Okay, the vast majority of software development functions, large and small, use Agile, and it's just starting to catch on in other applications. So I'm actually a good example of someone in a non-software role, right? We have a department called Enterprise Agility at CA Technologies, and we pretty faithfully practice Scrum, and actually it's evolved into a hybrid that we call Scrumban, and it has really helped us to deliver better value to our customers. So what I wanted to do today was just talk a little bit about Agile, where it came from. I will check in with you all about what you know already, and I want to reemphasize that point that you should ask questions at any time. I'll be a little bit off my game if I have to talk for 50 straight minutes without hearing from any of you. So let's get the discussion going and make sure that we give people what they need. So let me go ahead and proceed here. First thing I like to do in these types of presentations is establish a purpose, right? Hopefully we're all here for the same reason and hoping to get something similar out of it. So my purpose today is to provide instructional designers with guidance on how to get started with Agile. And we will do that by briefly reviewing the history, principles, and terminology of Agile before providing examples of how Agile can be applied to instructional design and performance improvement. And that is so that you guys can commit to an action plan for leveraging the benefits of Agile. So with any luck, you'll learn something, and you'll also have a better idea in your head of how to proceed and improve your own practice of Agile. Now, you can speak up if you like, but if anyone wants to just, usually if I'm in a live scenario, I would ask for confirmation from everybody that this purpose is suitable for them. So could you just give an indication in the chat, yes, no, if this purpose is okay for you, or if there's anything that you would like to do to modify it before we continue. Okay, I see a lot of yeses. So let's go ahead on here. I mentioned before that I want to get a little bit of an idea about where you guys are with respect to Agile. So I'm going to put up 5 statements here, and please type in the chat box which one of these 5 statements best describes where you are right now. Put a 1 if you think, I hear the word Agile, but I have no clue what it really is. Number 2, I know at least a little bit about Agile. Number 3, I practice some form of Agile right now. Number 4, I am an Agile expert. Or number 5, Agile is a bunch of hooey. Okay, let's see, I see some 1s, a 2, a couple of 2s, a 3, 3/4, 1. Okay, so it looks like the majority of you are in the 1, 2, 3 range. So we have one person who is a self-described expert. Let me see who that was. I might call on you later. Tara, okay, or Tara. So might be looking for you to help us answer some of these questions. Now there was one question that went by before. I wonder if we should touch on that. From Susan B. How do you adjust the ID side of Agile when the tech side of Agile impacts your plan? That's a great question. I think we're going to touch on that a little bit later, Susan. But definitely one of the things that teams struggle with is being in a situation where everybody is approaching work in a completely different way, right? A different mindset, different work methods, and so forth. And so one of the obvious things that happens is um, the cadence of delivery. If that's out of whack, if you have one group of people who are working on a 2 week cadence, delivering value every 2 weeks, side by side and interacting with a function that delivers work every 6 months, that's going to cause a problem. Or if you have another function next to you that takes longer to do things than is acceptable for your cadence of work, that can be a problem. So in the ID world, for instructional design, we run into this where we might create an e-learning and we'll make it so small and create it in such little pieces that we're ready to deliver something within 2 weeks. But then it takes our operations function, who runs our learning management system, a week to implement the same e-learning. So that can cause a problem because we can't get completely finished and deliver something within 2 weeks based on that dependency. So I don't know if that touches on your questions, Susan, if you wanted to talk about that more before I move on. Susan's typing something, but I will go ahead and start moving forward. Our agenda for today is we'll give a little bit of background about Agile, and then I'll jump into an example of that shows how you can apply Agile principles to instructional design. We'll also talk about some of the things to consider if you're trying to practice Agile as a non-software team, right? So a lot of people who get started studying Agile get a little bit discouraged because it was invented by software people for software people. And so there's a lot of talk about coding and so forth, and sometimes there's some language that regular people like us can't necessarily relate to, and so I'll talk a little bit about how we navigate that. Then we'll have some discussion near the end and along the way. So what is Agile? So I have a definition here that I work off of. There are many of these out there, but I like to think of it as a set of work methods characterized by responsiveness to change and a relentless focus on collaboration. So as we get into talking about the principles and values of Agile, the two things that stand out to me are responsiveness to change, right? Planning work is an exercise in predicting the future, and no one can really predict the future. So how are you responsive when things change and your delicately planned work plan gets disrupted, right? And a relentless focus on collaboration. We'll talk along the way about how Agile doesn't really work as intended unless people work together, right? And leverage the strengths and talents of everybody involved. Were there any comments or feedback about that definition there? Anything that you'd like me to clarify? Tara says, sounds good. And will the slides be shared? Ernie, yes, they will. All right, let's go ahead then. So this artifact here, this is a page from the manifesto for Agile software development. Type a yes or no if you've heard of this thing before. It's commonly known as the Agile Manifesto, and I believe you can find it at agilemanifesto.org. Mixture of yeses and nos. Well, the Agile Manifesto was published in, I believe it was 2001, and it's really what kind of put Agile on the map. It's actually when the word Agile came to be. It wasn't necessarily the beginning of the movement. The beginning of the movement went back at least to the mid 90s with some other work methods that were developed, such as extreme programming. They kind of rebelled against the idea of people being kind of tired of failing projects, right? And they started to think about how they could work in a different way and have more success and more consistently deliver value. So it's very short. I think it's 60 some odd words, and I'll just read it quickly here. We are uncovering better ways of developing software by doing it, by helping others to do it. Through this work, we have come to value, and these next four things are the Agile values: individuals and interactions over processes and tools, working software over comprehensive documentation, customer collaboration over contract negotiation, responding to change over following a plan. That is, while there is value in the items on the right, we value the items on the left more. So this is an often quoted document. It's sort of treated by some Agilists like gospel. I mean, it was created by human beings, and it was actually about 15 years ago now. But there's a lot of wisdom in here, And when you start to look at what's going on with your team dynamic and how your work is succeeding or failing, these are great discussion points. And we'll get back into some of these later. But just know that that's when the Agile, this is kind of the watershed moment in the Agile movement. It wasn't quite the beginning, but it is when we learned the word Agile. So you'll see at the bottom there, those are the 17, they call them the original signatories of the Agile Manifesto. They met at a ski resort in Utah in 2001 and cooked this thing up. Anybody can go out to agilemanifesto.org and sign this thing, and there are thousands of signatures on it now. Here's where we are now. There's an organization called Version 1. They provide an agile planning tool that's pretty good, but not quite as good as CA Technologies Agile Central tool. But they do a great survey every year. It's called the State of Agile Survey, and they release the State of Agile report. So the top 3 benefits of Agile, as reported by people who responded to this survey, are these: ability to manage changing priorities, increased team productivity, and improved project visibility. So obviously, people were allowed to choose more than one benefit because it adds up to more than 100%. But that gives you an idea of why people gravitate to Agile. Those are pretty compelling benefits. And I think they represent a lot of the problems that teams have. Let's see. I want to just click over to the chat string a little bit here. It would be interesting to know how many of these people were IDs. The people who were respondents to the survey, that's actually explained in the Agile State of Agile report. You can check that out. I don't think it gets as granular as instructional design, but I think people reported that they might have been from human resources and related fields. And does visibility also mean adequate? I'm not sure if I know what that question means, Steve. Did you want to bring that up now?
Sponsorship is the ability of clients to deliver their side of the collaboration. So access to resources, people, access to data.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm wondering if the visibility is another way of saying that Agile is one of those things that tends to obtain more client sponsorship than traditional waterfall methods where people may be assigned a responsibility but not necessarily accountable.
Yeah. Well, there's a few things going on there, I guess, in that question, but just to get back to what project visibility means to me and how it relates to Agile, there is an Agile principle that says something along the lines of, the best results come from teams working with their customers on a daily basis, right? So one of the problems that you have with waterfall or long form project planning is that at the beginning you'll do the planning, and then at the end something will magically appear, right? Whereas with the Agile methods, there's going to be regular collaboration, regular demonstrations of work, and the customer or client or stakeholder, whoever it is that you're producing the work for, has a good idea of what's going on at all times and what's coming and when it's coming and so forth, right? And that provides opportunities to adjust and make sure that you're delivering what's going to actually add value for them. Does that address your question? Okay, good. All right, let's go ahead and move on. Now, you saw before the names of the 17 original signatories. When you start reading up on the history of this and everything like that, you might come up with your favorite Agile Manifesto signatory. And mine is this guy right here called Uncle Bob Martin, right? He's written a bunch of great books, and he's a wonderful guy to check out on YouTube. He's very passionate about all this stuff, and he likes to point out all the things that people forget about why Agile is a thing to start with and why we actually started doing it and why it's important. So he explains why we do Agile, and this is something that everybody should think about. We find a lot of times out in our work, a lot of people hear the buzzword and they might hear a mandate from an executive, and then that's their signal to start practicing Agile methods, start doing Scrum or start doing Kanban or whatever the thing might be. And that's not a good enough reason. And Uncle Bob explains. We are tired of writing crap. We are tired of embarrassing ourselves and our employers by delivering lousy software. We've had enough of telling our customers to reboot at midnight. We don't want bug lists that are 1,000 pages long. We don't want code that grows more tangled and corrupt with every passing day. We're tired of doing a bad job. We want to start doing a good job. So for me, this really captures what the deal is. Okay, it's not about adhering to processes. It's not about purchasing Agile Central from CA Technologies, although I think you should. It's about becoming better as a team. He uses the word we all over the place, right? It doesn't say I. Working as a team and doing an increasingly good job. You're either getting better or you're not getting better, right? And as long as you're getting better, that's a good thing. There is built into the practice of Scrum, if any of you do it, a regular retrospective. So our team, at the end of every 2 weeks, we have a meeting specifically dedicated to talking about what went well and what we can improve on. And as a takeaway from that, we make a commitment to do one thing to improve whatever our most egregious problem is at that time. Right? Very powerful. If you can set up a system and process to do that, that's going to be really key to continuous improvement, they call it. So, other methods call it different things, but continuous improvement is how I refer to it. So for those of you who were ones and twos in that first question here, I'll give a quick explanation of the distinction between Waterfall and Agile, which we've talked about a couple of times. Waterfall is basically an end-to-end process, right, where you pre-plan all of the work and you think of all the tasks and dependencies and deliverables and finances and everything like that. You figure out, you cross every T, dot every I, and make a huge, gigantic project plan that's very well thought out. Okay, so if any of you are PMPs from PMI, this is basically the method that you learned, right? How to think of everything. The problem with that is that, as I mentioned before, you can't predict the future. So one thing to keep in mind is if you create this beautiful, gigantic project plan that covers the next 3 months or 9 months or what have you, the day after you create it, you know more about the situation than you did when you wrote that thing, right? And so that's going to just come back. You're going to be reminded of that constantly for the remainder of that slog. At least that's been my experience. I got a lot of feedback from my technical editor on my book, Agile Performance Improvement, because I characterized ADDIE as a waterfall method, and it doesn't necessarily need to be that way. We kind of agreed to disagree, but overall, most of the situations I've seen in ID shops is that ADDIE is laid out as a waterfall method. On the other hand, Agile is better represented as a circle, right? So you have small development iterations that go on, and there could be a whole bunch of them strung together to achieve the same thing as one big waterfall project would. So you could think of it as a little mini ADDIE cycle that happens every 2 weeks. At the end of the 2 weeks, you look at what you did, and then you figure out what to do next, right? It gives you ample opportunity to adjust along the way. All right. So that's the most simple way that I could think of to depict the distinction between waterfall and agile. Large pre-planned versus short and frequent replanning. All right. Now, what agile isn't, in my estimation, and sometimes it's easy to get into this, is to say, okay, we're going to spend 2 weeks on A, and then we're going to spend 2 weeks on the first D, and another 2 weeks on the second D, and so you basically are taking 5 iterations to go through ADDIE. That's not really agile, right? At the end of agile, you should be delivering something that is of some use to somebody, right? So having an audience analysis, not really useful to any end users, right? Having a design document or a half-built e-learning that doesn't quite work yet, that's not delivering value. So you have to think in terms of how small do I need to make the little ADDIE so that I can deliver something frequently. Okay. I haven't really been monitoring the chat box, but are there any questions? Anyone want to request the microphone to ask anything at this point? Lisa says, agreed, ADDIE is done in circles all along the way. Okay, good. All right, I'll move on. So here's my summary of the 5 big things about the Agile methods, okay? I'm in my house here in sunny Marblehead, Massachusetts today. You can't see my bookshelf, but it's filled with all these big books with big words in them and so forth. And one of the things that I run into all the time, I ran into it myself, I continue to run into it, and I hear it from people who are getting started all the time. It's just so complicated, right? So what are really the big things about the Agile methods? And so I boiled it down to these 5 things. And these are the ones that I generally gravitate back to when I'm answering questions. The first one is work on the most important thing first. Okay, so too many times I see work functions, and this has nothing to do with Agile, spending time working on crap that no one cares about, right? This happens all the time in training and e-learnings and everything else, right? You get put into the order taking mode and you work really hard to make this beautiful thing that's not making any difference in performance, right? So work on the most important things first. Limit work and process. This refers to how much stuff do you have going on at the same time? How many balls do you have up in the air? How many things do you have on your to-do list? The more you can focus on working on fewer things and making and really uh, kicking butt on those few things and making them really good and really valuable, the better off you're going to be. All right. So related to the first thing, too many times we have situations where, and we fall prey to this as well, right? We'll get started with too many things and not finish anything, right? And it's really a tragedy to have, be 90% done with a whole bunch of things and not done with anything. Okay. Third one, frequently deliver in small increments. I think I explained that already. So the idea of you're much better off delivering something small right away than waiting months and months to deliver something that might miss the mark. So you'll find out really quickly if you're on the right track, and if you're on the right track, you keep going. If you're not on the right track, you adjust from there. Fourth one, make it a team sport. I explained that one already as well, right? Um, all of the agile methods assume that people are going to be collaborating. There are all sorts of books and blogs and ideas about different ways to be collaborative, but ultimately it raises a lot of interesting questions about how you manage teams and what do you do if one person is producing more than another. But overall, it's a team sport. That's a whole nother hour actually. And then continuously improve. I spoke about that earlier. The idea is that you want to do a good job, like Uncle Bob says, right? You don't want to do a bad job, and the only way to go from where you are now to where you want to be is to improve a little bit at a time. So that's the end of that section there. So let me go ahead and check in with the chat box before I get into how this applies to instructional design. Looks like there are a couple of comments here. I'm having a hard time stretching out the box here. Steve had something about a colleague in Canada who's using Agile on a province-wide healthcare project. Um, in addition to writing application code, the project will also employ online performance support and knowledge management. The team is using Agile, screen prototypes for different customer groups. Is this approach in the spirit of regular delivery, or should the sprints deliver software? Let me read this again. Yeah, I think prototypes don't sound like actual things that people are actually using, right? So in the Agile principles from the Agile Manifesto, it says that the primary measure of progress is working software, right? So it's working whatever, working e-learnings, whatever. So the idea is that whatever you deliver should be viable and be able to be used by people. So let me know if that answers your question. I think that was from Steve. I see design docs is most useful for the designer. My clients do appreciate. Okay, that's from Lisa. And Tara agrees with me. So Lisa has a thing in here. What if you're creating ILT, not software? Okay, that's a great question. I think you have to start thinking of things the same way. Okay, my experience has been I spent a bunch of years as an instructional designer, and if you think about it, an instructor-led training class being let's say one day on a certain topic, right? That takes a matter of certainly weeks, but more likely months to actually properly design, right? Pilot, right? Get the feedback, revise it, etc. Um, and what if you spend all that, you invest all that time? Let's say you invest 4 months developing this beautiful instructor-led training, and then it ends up being no good, right? Or the methodology is wrong, or the objectives are wrong, or whatever. That's a disaster, right? You've just wasted all that time, and you can calculate how much money that has cost you, right? So instead, think in terms of creating smaller bits. So maybe you think about like your objectives, and if you have a one-day class that has, let's say, 8 objectives and 8 modules, right? And presumably all those objectives have some sort of business purpose. Can you pinpoint the one that's going to make the biggest difference in solving a business problem and develop that one first and then pilot that one, right? Go from there and then see what you want to do. There's a pretty good chance that your 8-hour course, if it ends up being that, is not going to look like the one that you pre-planned when you barely knew anything about the situation and how it was going to turn out. That actually is tied into the example I want to talk to you guys about. So maybe I'll just go ahead and toggle to that now. So here's the scenario, okay? This is a scenario. So actually, I want to take a second and acknowledge Sinead Condon, who's a colleague of mine from CA Technologies, who's on the line here today. We work in this function called Enterprise Agility, as I mentioned, and a lot of it has to do with consulting and delivering workshops. And a lot of them start with a request just like this. In fact, I just got one about an hour before we got on the phone. Someone calls up or writes an email and says, I'd like to request a gigantic training program. Right, Lisa? So here's a breakdown of how the waterfall versus agile scenario goes, right? So in waterfall, here's what you do. You're like, okay, you want a gigantic training program, articulate the learning objectives, create a correspondingly gigantic project plan, and then see you in 6 months, right? That's pretty much how it goes in a nutshell. In Agile, we do it this way. And I think I already started to describe this before I clicked to the slide. Find out what would add the most value right now. Commit to an experiment. Demonstrate what you have after 2 weeks. And if viable, the customer has something they can use after 2 weeks, right? And replan. And this is actually a little bit how it's turning out with my interactions with Professor Steve, right? When we met earlier this year and we talked about me coming to do a session with you guys, we initially kind of scoped out an idea for me to do 3 or 4 of these webinars, right? And I think the waterfall thing to do would have been for me to, sit there and like write out all these PowerPoints and do all this planning and scheduling. Steve would do scheduling and so forth. We decided to not do it that way. What we decided to do was have this first program today, which is an experiment. We'll see how it goes. If you guys aren't into it, if Steve's not into it, we won't do another one. That'll be it. If it looks like that it's adding some value, we'll talk about doing another one, right? And that makes it so that we are really efficient and we're developing value. We chose the topic that we thought was going to add the most value right now, which is this thing about instructional design. Once we finish with this, we'll look at the other ideas we had and see what the next best one for us to do is. Okay. So this is tied into, I mentioned the Agile Manifesto principles, which are, it's a subpage on agilemanifesto.org, but our highest priority is to satisfy the customer through the early and continuous delivery of valuable software. And I put software in the little bracket there because it could apply to e-learnings or cookies or whatever the thing is you're talking about. Okay, so rather than doing a lot of planning and see you in 6 months, we deliver faster, and then we treat each thing as an experiment where we can improve. So here's something that really happened that's related to this. And I tell this story in my book. The request came in, and this person at our company runs an infrastructure program that includes keeping the servers up and running for all the software testing to be done. So our company has thousands of software engineers. Many of them do testing of the new features. And so this is kind of a big deal, right? And he said, I want to have an e-learning that includes a series of 16 short training videos to show software testers best practices. Put best practices in finger quotes because there's not necessarily any best practices. Really, they're just things that work for somebody else that might work for you. But that's another hour. I won't get into that right now. But so obviously the consulting went along and we talked about the business problem. The software testers, this person said, are causing system outages from not following these 16 best practices. So his hypothesis was, and he had data about all the system outages, is that the software testers or the people doing the software testing would do certain behaviors, he called them, that would trigger an outage on the system, right? On those testing machines, those ones in the middle there, right? So his thing was like, well, here's the 16 possible things that these guys are doing wrong. So let's give them videos, and then they should stop doing that, and everything will be fixed, right? We performance consultants love to hear that, right? So did some further analysis, some further probing. The outages are happening nearly every day. But looking at these outage reports, we found that only 4 behaviors were causing outages. So in other words, he had 16 best practices that he wanted to make sure that the engineers were following. But when you look at the outage reports, only 4 of those behaviors were causing outages. So one of them is an example. A lot of times the testers will, they'll get the code from the person who wrote the code, and then they'll set it up to go through this automated testing process on these servers, and sometimes it takes a long time, like hours or whatever. So what they'll do is at 5 o'clock, when they're getting ready to go home, they'll set it up and they'll press the go button, and then they'll go home, and then they come back the next day and they find out that at about 5:10, the server blew up and no testing was done, and nobody else in the rest of the world, since we have engineers all over the world, could do their testing because the system was down. So it's a disaster. It was costing tens of thousands of dollars in lost productivity every time this happened, and it was happening nearly every day, right? So you have 4 behaviors that were directly contributing to those outages, such as don't press the button at 5 o'clock and then walk away before you see that it starts working. That's one of them. That's a video right there. And then, oh, by the way, they need more server capacity. Because the problem was, when we investigated a little further, that if you have, hundreds of engineers pressing that go button at the same time, that overwhelms the system, right? So they need to add server capacity. So that was one of the things they found out. Kind of ties into the idea that they need a more holistic solution, right? More than just giving them training videos. And of course, that's something as performance consultants we want to do. So our approach was, here's the agile way to do it. Develop one video based on the most egregious cause that has to do with the testers, right? So obviously, they knew that they needed to create more servers, but they also wanted to, make sure that these testing behaviors. So the first one was that one about like, hey, make sure that when you press that button at 5 o'clock, that you stick around and make sure that it's actually rolling, and that you're not causing the thing to blow up because it's overloaded. And we decided to demonstrate and release that one video before working on the other 3. And it turned out that one video solved about half of the problem with respect to engineer behaviors, right? So think about that, right? So for one thing, we're releasing that one video that's solving most of the problem, right? And that is causing all the downstream avoidance of problems, right? So not only is it taking us less effort to create one video than to create 16 initially, where we're adding value, but we're already avoiding outages. If we had created all 16 videos, it would have taken months, and all these outages would have been happening, and 3/4 of the videos would have had nothing to do with the problem that was articulated by our client. So this is related to Agile Manifesto principle number 3. Deliver working software, in this case, eLearning videos, frequently from a couple of weeks to a couple of months with a preference to the shorter time scale. All right, so we kept that in mind. Now, I want to toggle over to the results and actually what happened here. But let me see if there are any other questions or comments that we should go through here in the chat. Susan said, I think this was a few minutes ago, they may have something to see in 2 weeks, but only if they can provide you with something to start with that is fairly set when they first engage you. I don't know if Susan, if you wanted to jump on, I'd love to hear another voice, but could you tell me more about that question? I'm not sure if we already addressed it, or, okay, here she comes. Meanwhile, Steve said, this is also pretty darn quick and good performance analysis. Thank you for that compliment, Steve. It wasn't quite as easy as that one slide makes it sound, but overall, we were trying to get to the point.
Hi, how are you?
Good. I can hear you now. I think there might be a tiny bit of a delay, but that's okay. You sound clear.
Okay. Okay, so I can tell you a story about a recent project. This was a new process that had maybe 5 to 6 different screens that the user would go through to accomplish the process. And they were all assigned to different teams who had their own 2-week sprint schedules.
Uh-huh.
And in order for the user, the end user, they had to go through slide A or image A through F, let's say, A through F.
Okay.
But some teams were working on slide C, and some teams were working on slide E. And slide A was coming after slide C. So they weren't working on it first. They were working on it as they felt their work effort required them to work on it. In the meantime, we didn't have screenshots to work with. We didn't have mock-ups. We didn't know what the screens were going to look like so that we could pretend to get at least something started. And it made it very difficult for us to start anything because we didn't know what the beginning was and we weren't sure what the middle would look like, and the end seemed to be okay, but we didn't know how we were going to get there. And another thing that seemed to happen in these different types of situations is that there's no interval allowed in the Agile process on the tech side for a training interval to have the learners learn what it is that they've just developed and want to implement. It's like, we developed it, you signed off on it, we can implement it, it's going into production. It's your problem how fast you can get the people trained to know what's going on. So there's a disconnect there when you have multiple teams working on different components, but your project is the beginning to end. You need to know everything that's going on. So maybe I'm just venting, but if you have an opinion on what we could do to do better to work with them in that situation, that would be appreciated.
Okay.
The
Well,
end.
thanks for that anecdote there. Yeah, I had a couple of things popped out to me as you told that story, and I guess I'm sounding a little bit like a therapist during this part of the chat. Um, Having multiple teams working on one thing almost sounds like individuals each working on their own thing, right? And if they're not talking to each other and there's not really an overall roadmap or unifying approach, then the things that you said happened are going to start happening pretty predictably. So I guess to apply it to some of the things that I talked about, there needs to be a clear and unifying vision of what's going to be created. And even in that case, if there are multiple screens, you might want to create one screen at a time and test that out. So, presumably the screens have some sort of consistent style or template or what have you. And, by doing one, you can identify problems there, right? Like what if the thing is just people can't really use it very easily, right? It's better to have one screen that's not very usable than to have six and have to correct all six of them. Once you get into talking about multiple teams working on the same mission or project, things get much more complicated. Okay, I talked about books before. There are all kinds of books and websites and everything else dedicated to the idea of how you scale Agile. And how do you have more than one team working on the same thing? And it just gets incrementally more complicated the bigger it gets. It's manageable, and obviously there are things out there that more than 8 people work on at a time. But understand that those teams need to be in sync if they're going to produce something reliably useful. The other thing that you brought up that I thought was interesting was the idea of producing the thing versus training the people to use it. That's going to get back to in Agile terms what you define as your story or your work item. So it might be that you define the story as we're going to create this thing and people are going to be able to use it, or you might bifurcate those things and treat them as separate. But usually what you would do is, I talked about replanning every 2 weeks. You don't really only plan every 2 weeks, right? You should be doing a kind of a big roadmap or a larger, sometimes in software they might call it like a release level view, right? Like what is the stuff that we're going to create over the next 3 months or year or whatever, and kind of like roughly lay that out by time period. So you might be like the first quarter, which is like 5 or 6 sprints, we're going to do this stuff. Then the next quarter, we're going to do these things in the 5 or 6 sprints, etc. And at the end, we should have something that roughly looks like what we what we thought of at the beginning, right? The difference is that once you finish that first sprint or you finish that first quarter, you're revisiting and replanning, right? So you're not doing detailed, intricate planning of every single thing that's going to happen over the next month. You're going to do careful and detailed planning of what's going to happen in the very short term, right? And then revisit the rest of that plan all along the way. So the closer it is to happening, sometimes they say waiting until the last responsible moment, right? Do the thing that you know you're doing now, and then when you're done doing that, then look at the next thing. So those are just a couple of things. I don't know if any of that is helpful, but those are kind of the things that popped in my head when you told us that story. So let me go ahead and go. I know I'm trying to keep an eye on time here. A couple more things I want to go through. So here's what happened. When I was thinking about that story about the servers and the 16 behaviors and how we ended up doing training on only 4 of the 16 behaviors that they wanted to know about, the outages went down, okay, which was good. They went down in part because of the engineering behaviors being changed, like that don't press the button at 5 o'clock thing, and they also went down because they added server capacity, right? And they both contributed to the solution. But the thing that I thought was interesting was kind of the cost avoidance in just creating and delivering the training as they wanted, right? So if we had done things the way that they wanted to do them, you see the as requested column, this is what would have happened, versus in the right-hand column, the as delivered, how we ended up doing it. So if you total it all up, you're talking about number of employees trained. When we looked at it, they wanted to train everybody on these engineering behaviors, and we made them realize that they only needed to train the people who actually are doing the testing, which is about half of the people, right? The original thing that they wanted to do with the 16 videos would take an hour for people to go through. At $150 an hour, that's our blended value or a blended cost for an engineer's time versus a quarter of an hour, right? The cost of the time is all calculated. And then the development time, right? So to develop 16 videos necessarily takes 4 times as long as to develop 4 videos, right? So you see the cost there and the instructional designer with their blended rate. So those are all kind of non-precise estimates, but generally speaking, that's about what happened, right? I didn't go to the we used the kind of standard blended rates. Obviously, people make different amounts of money and stuff like that, but you can see the difference, right? We basically just by making the training shorter saved over $100,000 in repurposed labor, and that ties into Agile Manifesto principle number 10. Simplicity, the art of maximizing the amount of work not done, is essential. Okay. And I guarantee you, if you look at the work that you're doing now and you figure out a way to quantify it and you're really honest about what kind of results you're getting, maybe you don't have to tell your boss, but you can talk to yourself. Most of the work that we all do is not really adding any value, right? So the whole game is, this is for Agile and this is also for human performance technology, is how do you focus on the stuff that's actually going to make a difference? And that's the whole game to me. Okay, so now we're to the what questions do you have? So let me go back to the chat here. Actually, I wanted to, I mentioned before my colleague, Sinead Condon, on the call. Is Sinead still on the call? And if she is, I would invite her to come on the line for a minute and maybe give a thought or two, because she's just as much of an expert on this stuff as I am, and I'd love to hear what she thought about today's experiment, which I don't think she's seen this exact presentation. Her mic doesn't seem to be working, she says. So I'll accept that, Sinead, for now. Anybody else want to come on here? Tara, I'm sorry if I'm not pronouncing your name. Scrum's cross-functional team members. Did you want to come on and talk to us about that for a second? And what you were getting at there, if that was a question or if that was a comment? Oh, that was just to help point out. Okay, so Steve has a question here, and Steve, feel free to come on if you want to talk about this live. But he says, what is driving the increased move towards Agile? IT budgets, the executive suite, customers, increased pressure to respond to change? Well, that's an interesting question. I guess this would go into my speech / diatribe about what's behind the growth in Agile. I mean, certainly, I think that those well-intentioned meanings, as far as like why people are doing Agile at the beginning, the increased transparency and the responsiveness to change, that's important, right? if you look at this, even in software, and this is becoming increasingly true in every business, the ability to be responsive is important. So if you look at what's happening with, large corporations, and how some of them are being driven out of business by, very small startups. Part of that has to do that the small startups, just by the nature of how few people they have, right, and how they're not geographically distributed, et cetera, they're going to be more responsive and they're going to be quicker to market their innovations, right? That's one thing. The Another thing is that certainly Agile has done a pretty good job of marketing itself over the past 15 years or so. And some of these businesses that are out there that certify you, like the Scrum Alliance and the Scaled Agile Inc., and others, they make a compelling case and they are helping to kind of spread the word. And there are all sorts of Agile experts and gurus and so forth, that have really turned Agile into a cottage industry. For me, it's more about. I'm somewhat of an Agile evangelist, which you probably picked up on. For me, it's just about figuring out ways to work better, right? Figuring out ways to make work more meaningful for yourself, right? Making yourself doing things that have purpose at work, being collaborative more so than competitive with your colleagues. All these things, to me, make all this stuff really appealing, right? We have a great team over at CA Technologies in our function, and trust is building, and we're achieving greater and greater things. And so I think there are a lot of factors that go into the rise of Agile, but it's coming, and people keep every once in a while, if you look up Agile is dead, you'll see all kinds of blog articles by people wanting to be the first to declare that it's over. But it's not over, it's still growing. If you look at the numbers of people practicing it, numbers of certifications and so forth, it's still growing. Tara talks about the explosion of mobile apps, and that's definitely a factor. Those are developed quickly, and obviously huge companies have a hard time being responsive and producing things quickly. What's the migration path for the rest of the organization? IDs seem to be going the last to get involved. Yeah, that's sort of what we're seeing at our company too. Like, our education functions are increasingly trying to do things in an agile way, and like we mentioned earlier, they want to be compatible with what others are doing as far as their cadences and so forth. But again, I think if you focus too much on the processes and the tools, that's where you can get hung up and you can never really get there and never really get better. And I think the key is to focus on getting better and focus on collaborating better, and following those agile principles that we talked, or values and principles that we talked about along the way here. That's really what it's all about, right? And then, if you want to call it agile, that's cool. Oh, here's the question I didn't think I was going to get. What do you think about SAM as an agile approach to ID? I have to confess I've not gone to the SAM workshop, although I got an email about it this week. I haven't read the book. I flipped through it. It seems like there's definitely some potential there. I kind of wonder about how the iterations are set up. It looked like SAM is kind of a way to structure ADDIE so that the stages happen in more predictable and recurring iterations, but I don't know if I'm necessarily qualified to provide any more feedback on that. But I'd love to talk to you outside of this, Michelle. Okay, I know we're getting near the top of the hour. I want to kind of get to the end here because I want to do a little feedback from you guys. Something I didn't go through here, and I mentioned this before, that sometimes you go to these conferences and they'll say stuff like, Scrum is simple, but it's not easy. And that's really catchy, and it looks good on a T-shirt. Like I have this green T-shirt that says it. But it's not simple, right? It's complicated. There's all this stuff in here, and all these terms that are associated with Scrum, and all these different methods, and these don't even really include many of the engineering terms that you have to grapple with to get through this stuff. So don't make it complicated, okay? That's why I had that thing before about breaking down like the 5 big things. If you want to get started with Agile, all right, you can read the books and all that kind of stuff, but you can think about to yourself, What's holding your team back from doing better, right? Now, here's where we get into the human performance technology, the ISPI stuff. What success measure will let you know if the team performance is improving? I have a whole other hour on how you do that, but you should be able to get that far, right? Like, what's holding us back, and how will we know if we're improving? And then think about what one action can we take right now that will make the greatest difference. All right. And that's hard to narrow down. So if you went around the room and asked everybody what the one thing we could work on now, you're going to have a lot of different answers, right? But you can only do one. I said one thing, not eight things. You know, I've done this as an activity with real teams that are trying to grapple with this stuff, and it it takes some real discussion and really collaborative thinking to get it down to one thing and figuring out where to start. But it's up to the team. Principle number 12 says, at regular intervals, the team reflects on how to become more effective, then tunes and adjusts its behavior accordingly, right? So don't do this just once. Like I said, our team does it every 2 weeks, faithfully and seriously, and that's really responsible for a lot of our improvement. Like we make time for it, and we're very serious about improving. So every 2 weeks we choose one thing to work on. I know there are a couple more questions coming in. I'll stay on, but I want to, or I can take emails, but I wanted to have you guys do a quick course evaluation for me because this was an experiment for me. And maybe you can put this stuff in the chat box, or you could email it to me if you want to bob.winter@ca.com, bob.winter@ca.com. But I'd love to see you guys just type these things in here. What's the most valuable thing you learned today? And after you get done with that, what's next for you with respect to Agile? You know, I'd like to know where people are. Are you gonna read more? Are you gonna go back and talk to your team about what the one thing you can improve is, or whatever that is? And I'll give you a minute to do this whole thing, but I'd love to see these answers either in an email to bob.winter@ca.com or in the chat box. I'll gather these things up. We have this one question that we use. This we don't do the traditional smile sheets with the Likert scale, but we have this question here. It's called the Net Promoter Score question. How likely would you be to recommend this presentation to colleagues or peers? You can put a 10 if you totally agree with that statement. You can put a 1 if you don't agree with it at all, or something in between. And that's kind of how we quantify our results here. So comments are, what's the most valuable thing? What's next for you? And rate your level of agreement. How likely would you be to recommend this presentation, 1 to 10? Quick plug for my book. It's called Agile Performance Improvement. Steve has looked at it, and he tells me he liked it. So I recommend you go out and buy copies. The holidays are coming up, so maybe you want to buy about 4 or 5 copies and give them out to your family. You can find me in all the usual channels. I told you my email, but I'm also on the Twitter, and I have a blog that I contribute to once in a while, but there's a bunch of articles up there that you might find interesting. And there we go, Steve, 159. I'm happy to stick around. I'm happy to stick around for a few more minutes, but I realize that we do have a time box here.
That was a very well-timed sprint and within the time box. So
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Looking over the chat window, and it's clear that people are taking the reflection seriously, which is a really good thing. I know I've walked away with some realizations myself, and am looking forward to continuing our conversations.
Excellent. I appreciate you all having me here today. I will definitely take the chat questions and so forth, and I can do sort of a FAQ type response to the questions that we didn't address, at least the ones I can figure out, and we'll go from there. But I definitely appreciate everybody listening and giving me feedback. And, next time you'll get to meet Sinead.
Cool. The other thing is that the OPWL department will post a PDF version of your slides when we add the recording of your webinar to our website, and we'll let you know about that too if you want to reach out and snag that.
Okay, excellent.
And if you want to share any responses to unanswered questions, we'll be sure to post those too.
Yeah, that'll be great.
So at this point, I think we can say that our regularly scheduled program is concluding. And Bob, thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us today.
My pleasure. Thanks to you guys.
And thanks to everyone who participated. We really appreciate you being here. And this is the end of our OPWL webinar. Thanks for being here. Bye now.